Hi, I'm John Moulis, and welcome to another in my series of videos about my time at the Department of Finance in Canberra and the relentless campaign of bullying and harassment that I had to endure. Now, the really bad year of 1984 finished, and 1985 started. And, people were saying, well, we managed to get through 1984 without Big Brother watching and without that all the terrible things that happened. Well, they may have been able to get through it, but that Big Brother world happened to me. It was just a shocking year. Now, in 1985, certain things had happened. The AIDS hysteria had been whipped up by the media, and the gym that I went to, the Deakin Health Spa in Canberra, had gained a reputation for being a pick-up place for gays. I mean, it was going on in the male sauna. It had become, and up until then, up until the AIDS hysteria, the boss of the gym could tolerate it. I mean, there was a pool in the gym. He ran the Burley Griffin Swim Club, which was a feeder club for Olympic selection. I mean, in 1984, that was the year of the Los Angeles Olympics, and I think 7 swimmers from the Burley Griffin Swim Club went to the Los Angeles Olympics. The Australian Institute of Sport was still getting into its stride. I mean, the AIS had only been established for 3 years up until then, so they really didn't really get into their stride as being the main supplier of Olympic athletes. It was still up to the grassroots swimming clubs to supply the bulk of the swimmers. And so anyway, and they had lots of young kids in the swim club as well. And up until then, nobody said anything about it. But all of a sudden, when the AIDS hysteria happened, it suddenly became a no-no. And I was very high profile because of my letters to the editor and everything like that. So they decided to make an example of me. And they kicked me out of the gym. And it was fairly traumatic for me to be kicked out of the gym because, like I said, I mean, I thought I was going really well there. I mean, it was before anti-discrimination laws in the ACT or anything like that. So I had no recourse at all. And like I said, I'd been making a bit of money there with my fitness and making programs for other people and everything. But I think that another one of the reasons why they kicked me out was I think that somebody had told the boss about me making money, making out programs for people and being a personal trainer in there. I think that maybe things had caught up with me there. So anyway, I was kicked out of that gym and I went up to Queensland again for another holiday. I was going up there to Noosa and Surfers Paradise, Bribie Island as well. And on that occasion I decided not to stay in Taree. I decided to stay 2 days in Ballina on the way up the coast up to Brisbane because, you left Sydney I think you left at about 5:30 in the afternoon and you got up to Brisbane at about 6:30 or 7:30 in the morning. And so you had to, most people took the trip straight up, but I always liked to have a break either in Taree, where my relatives were, or that year I decided to have a break in Ballina because I wanted to see Byron Bay. So anyway, I borrowed another $2,000 from the credit union for that holiday. I think $2,500 I might have borrowed that year. And I stayed overnight in Ballina. And that was a nice little town. I really liked it. I mean, the first night I was there at the water slide park. with the local guys there in Ballina, and they were friendly and affable, and the next day I took the Blanch's coach, which was a minibus, up to Byron Bay. And I took the camera there, was taking the photos and all of that. And even then I said, you know, this is a really nice place. It was long before it became a boom town. It was before Paul Hogan and John Cornell moved there and made it a millionaire's playground. I mean, back then it was a traditional New South Wales country town and all that. And that area up there was called the Summerland area. They had Lismore there, was the big city there, the city. It was about 40,000 people there, and Byron Bay was the surfing capital of Australia, and you know, I think someone said it was the Dole capital. There were lots of people there on the Dole, and lots of hippies and alternative people there in Nimbin and in the hinterland. And so I thought, this is a really nice place. And anyway, I had to get back. You know, I went to the most easterly point in Australia, took photos there, and the lighthouse and all of that. And then I was part of my photography was taking photos of people. You know, and back then people were really easygoing about getting their photo taken. You'd ask them if you could take their photo, and 9 out of 10 times they would say yes. I mean, it was a much more easygoing time. It was before CCTV cameras, before the internet, before anything like that, and before identity theft, and you could take people's photos. They would pose for photos and everything. So anyway, I got back to Ballina and went up to Noosa and all of that, and what had happened is that the AIDS hysteria, the newspapers had pumped up the AIDS hysteria, and there was a perfect storm of events. I started thinking about the year that I just had at Department of Finance, and I was looking forward to another year like that. You know, I knew that the campaign against me wasn't going away, that it was going to be pumped up even further. You know, as I stayed on there and as I refused to resign, they would step it up another notch, and they'd keep stepping it up and up and up until I finally cracked, until I lost my mind and resigned. I mean, and I was looking at the year ahead, and you know, and day after day there were these front page headlines about, you know, all gays were going to die of AIDS, this apocalypse was going to happen, and all of that. And you know, and in Noosa I rented a bike, a push bike, and I travelled down to Maroochydore on the bike and back up again. And when I got back to my motel room one time, I realised that one of my films was gone. That the rucksack had a pocket on the side of it, and one of the films and they were some of my best shots, really good roll of film. Anyway, I got back to the side of the road where it happened, and someone had run over the canister of film, and it was sprawled out on the side of the road, and that set me off. I mean, I was crying and screaming and carrying on there on the side of the road, just howling, and everything had just closed in, and I didn't realise at the time that I was having a nervous breakdown because of everything that had happened over the past year, because of what was happening, because of what I was facing when I was going to return to Canberra. I mean, you know, things were going to get worse. It was just a terrible, and I couldn't do anything about it because I had to pay off those loans, and it just seemed to be a dreadful tunnel of depression, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel. It was just awful, and you know, people were driving past in the car. Nobody stopped to help me. I mean, nobody stopped and asked if I was all right. Nobody called the police or anything. And finally, I mean, I was there for about half an hour on the side of the road like this, screaming and yelling and crying. And finally I stopped and got back on the bike and got back to the motel room. And I spent the rest of my holiday in Noosa there, and I went down to Surfers Paradise, and you know, I went to Bribey Island as well. And so anyway, I decided that I wanted to go back to Byron Bay. I mean, by this stage, I'd been on holiday for about 3 weeks, I think, and that time was more pronounced that being away from Canberra, being away from bureaucrats and politicians and freezing cold winters and just plastic people and a plastic city, a fake city, fake people, you know, and bastards and people running off to bosses and complaining and everything. And I started liking it. I thought, you know, this is great. And the previous 2 times I'd been up to Queensland, I hadn't been to Byron Bay. You know, I mean, Noosa was a holiday resort, Surfers Paradise was a holiday resort, and Bribey Island was, to a lesser extent, a holiday resort as well. They weren't sort of residential places. I didn't consider them as places where I could move to and start a new life. But when I got to Byron Bay, that was a different story. I mean, I was there on the beach, reading newspapers. You know, you'd buy all the newspapers, read them on the beach, and just have this beautiful scene of with the lighthouse in the distance and the waves and everything. And I thought, you know, I could live like this. I mean, and you know, there were no politicians here, no bureaucrats. I mean, if I wanted a job, there was Lismore there, a city there with employment and all of that. There was what I always wanted. I wanted to be by the beach. I mean, in Byron Bay, there was a gym in Byron Bay, and there were bodybuilders in Byron Bay. I mean, one of the guys I took a photo of there in Byron Bay worked for Telstra, and he was a bodybuilder. I mean, everything, and there was TV stations there. There was the local TV station there, and there was talk about a repeater station in Surfers Paradise being built, which would relay the Brisbane channels down to the Summerland region. I mean, and there were newspapers there. I mean, unlike Canberra, I mean, Canberra had one stodgy daily newspaper, the Canberra Times, whereas up there in Byron Bay you had 2 local newspapers. You had the Northern Star from Lismore, and you had the Daily News from Murwillumbah. You know, and in addition to that, you had the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald, all of the papers that I was reading all the time, that I was buying and reading all the time. And you had the Brisbane papers as well. You had the Courier Mail and the Daily Sun and the Sunday Mail and the Sunday Sun. I mean, it was an embarrassment of riches up there. And the thought of having to go back to Canberra after, and I would ask people up there, and the other thing too is that I met a lot of people from Canberra up there who had moved up there. You know, they were running their own cafes. I mean, one of them, Carl Frommel, was from the Canberra Raiders. I mean, he was the beach inspector at Byron Bay, and all he did all day was just lie on the beach. I mean, that was paradise. That was a tropical paradise. And, you know, the prospect of having to go back to Canberra again and put up with another year like the one I'd already had, it was a no-brainer. I mean, I wanted to move up there straight away, and the fact is, and I went back to Byron Bay, and I kept on phoning up finance, telling them, you know, I'm going to stay here for another week. I used up all my leave and some of my leave without pay to stay on there. And there was a surf carnival there as well, the New South Wales titles, in a couple of weeks' time. So I stayed on for that. And I was in Byron Bay long enough. I mean, night times in Byron Bay. It was before all the terrible violence and alcohol abuse started up. I mean, it was this beautiful place. It was just paradise. I mean, and you know, where I stayed, the Beacon Motel, right next to it was the Surfside pub, where I'd go in for a mixed grill every night. I mean, that whole block was redeveloped a couple of years later by John Cornell's Beach Hotel, and that was when the rot set in at Byron Bay. But at that stage in January, February 1985, it was still a real paradise, a nice little traditional New South Wales country town. It was a lot like Taree, but right on the beach, and I was asking people what it was like to live up there. You know, and the reply I always got was, it beats all. You know, there were Canberra people had moved up there. I mean, that was sea change before it became fashionable, before the term had even been coined. And I desperately wanted to join them. I wanted to live up there. And I tell you what, I mean, if I hadn't had those loans outstanding that I had to pay off, that locked me into the job in Canberra, I would have moved there. I would have stayed there. I would have phoned up Galloway and Walsh, and I would have said, look, you can stick your bloody job, you can stick your bloody complaints, you can stick your photocopying and everything. And, you know, and people who I came into contact with on the barge to Fraser Island, there was a couple of guys from Brisbane there who had a four-wheel drive, and you know, and they said where I came from, what I did, and I said, oh, I'm in the public service in Canberra, I do photocopying, and one of them said, sounds thrilling, and that really rammed it home to me, just how things had declined, that I'd been there in Canberra in the public service for more than 7 years. I had no money to show for it. I had nothing to show for it. All the money had been spent on records and supplements and all of that. I didn't have a car. I didn't have my own home. I mean, I hadn't gone overseas. You know, things, you know, I was still a base grader. You know, I hadn't been promoted or anything. I mean, everything else, everybody else had moved ahead and had got all of these things. But I was still there, essentially, the same as what I was the day I left school. You know, I hadn't progressed. Things were getting worse in Canberra. It was an absolute hellhole, a rotten job, working with people I hated, who hated me, and having to put up with psychological torture day after day with complaints and bullying and harassment. I mean, it was a no-brainer, and having to go back to Canberra after I'd experienced Byron Bay and all of that. I mean, going back to Canberra, it was an absolute, it was the worst possible thing I had to do, was to say goodbye to Byron Bay after the surf carnival and go back to Canberra again. But I had to do it. You know, I was trapped in it. You know, I had to do it. I had to go back into the job that I hated and go back in that. I mean, it just wasn't gelling anymore. It had lost its attraction, and I had just become totally stale in the job. There were no new challenges. It was just the same old thing day after day, this robotic thing of, and then the harassment from the directors and Galloway, the assistant secretary, and all of that. Oh, look, I had just had enough. I just couldn't continue anymore, and there seemed to be no way out, and I began getting suicidal, thinking that you know, when I got back into the job at finance, I thought, this is the only way out. There is no way out. And I didn't attempt suicide during that time, but I gave it heavy consideration. Well, anyway, this is about to run out again, so I'll say goodbye and come back for the next exciting episode.